Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the Hunger for Justice series. I'm just going to wait a few moments while attendees join into the Zoom room here. Thank you for joining this session. This episode is in collaboration with the Oakland Institute. This session is also being recorded and will be available live on YouTube. And the recording will be available for public viewing in the future as well. We will be populating the chat box to the Zoom room with links to follow today's speakers. We also encourage audience questions that can be submitted into the Q&A in the Zoom room or the chat boxes on the live stream platforms. A Growing Culture is a nonprofit organization advancing a culture of farmer autonomy and agroecological innovation. Thank you for joining us today. I'll hand it over to Lauren Cardelli.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is, I think we're almost 30 episodes into the Hunger for Justice broadcast, and there's a lot to think about. This is a time of great divide and polarization and, epic contradictions. 50 years ago, Norman Borlaug got awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for the Industrial Green Revolution. It was just announced that the World Food Program was the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. 50 years, same message. It's almost cyclical and it's pretty comical. The World Food Program is the response. It's a safety net in the world of industrial agriculture and corporate control. It's needed when we live in a society where indigenous and peasant food webs are under attack and assault every day. That's when the World Food Program exists. That's when it waves its hand. The irony is that all over the world, true leaders that are supporting a population who, while only controlling 19% of agricultural land, protects 90% of agricultural biodiversity and produces over 70% of the world's food consumed. That's the peasant food web. Fisherfolk, indigenous, smallholder, medium-scale farmers. That society is outproducing, but that society is under attack all over the world. One of our episodes of Hunger for Justice featuring an indigenous and Black activist, Chris Newman, at the end of his episode, he was asked for closing thoughts, and he shared that if the world is to be saved, it is to be saved because of Black, indigenous, and people of color. Now, we can reflect on that and say, of course, adversity breeds ingenuity, right? We can say that. Or we can say that the reason he meant that was because there's another way of seeing, there's another way of existing, another way of knowing. That other way exists not in the normative mindset of neoliberalism. It's not in there. It rests in the hearts of BIPOC individuals around the world and the indigenous communities. And we are so grateful for organizations like Oakland Institute, for the Right Livelihood Award, who recognize this and work together because our liberation is tied to each other's. That's the work. Because if this community outproduces industrial ag with all those barriers, let's just all take a deep moment to reflect on what they can do if we tip the balance in their favor. What kind of world we can have. And that's what peace is. It's the ability to have a diversity of thought, a diversity of opinion, a diversity of approaches. So today we are so grateful. We are humbled. We are in awe of Lottie and her work and her experience and her dedication to making the world better for all of us. We are in awe of partnering with Oakland Institute, with Josh and Anuradha, So thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you for going on this journey with each of us. Together, let's make this world better. Thank you, Anuradha. You're on mute, Anuradha.
Thank you, Lauren, so much for your words of wisdom, very poignant, as you reminded us this morning, as the news of the Nobel Peace Prize come in. I'm very honored to be in this episode and the series that A Growing Culture has organized, especially because of the two beautiful, incredible activists, thinkers, people who are doing the real work are with me. So I will first introduce Lottie Cunningham, who is the president and the founder of Sehutkan, a human rights organization struggling for indigenous rights, land rights in Latin America with focus on Nicaragua. I could go on and spend the next 1 hour to describe what Lottie's work is and who she is. But I think the best would be for the viewers to learn about Lottie when she speaks for herself. I'm also joined with Josh Mayer, fellow at the Oakland Institute, and I will share more about his work. Basically, I can say he's an academic researcher who's been working for many years now, looking at land rights, indigenous rights in Latin America, but more on both of them a little later. I want to get us started because, and I'll start with you, Lottie, if that is okay. You know, at the Oakland Institute, when we have worked on indigenous land rights, Nicaragua has often come up that it's a world leader in the granting and recognizing of indigenous land rights. For instance, it is recognized for Law 28 that established the autonomy of indigenous communities in the management of their land and natural resources, or Law 445, which regulates the communal property regime of the indigenous communities' lands. Lottie, it's just been like a little over a week when you were awarded the 2020 Right Livelihood Award, also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. This prize is in recognition of your ceaseless dedication to the protection of indigenous lands and communities from exploitation and plunder. So given this image of Nicaragua being a world leader in recognizing indigenous land rights, could you help us understand what are some of the key issues that the communities, Mosquito, Mayangana, and other indigenous and Afro-descendant communities face in the North Caribbean Coast Autonomous Region of Nicaragua?
Thank you all for this opportunity, and to all the organizer of this webinar, and to everyone for the opportunity to share our experience. First, I would like to say that yes, Nicaragua as a country has been, his legislation recognized the rights for autonomy and communal property for indigenous people and Afro-descendants people. As we see that in 1987, they established the Law 28, who recognizes self-determination of the indigenous and Afro-descendants people and the autonomous region of the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, and also establish the recognition of the communal property. And in that law, it's clear that the land could not be donated and it cannot be sold, and that any decision making about the natural resource is the community's member who have to say a word for that. And then comes in 2003 that they established the Law 445, who this law comes to guarantee the use and the control for indigenous communities and Afro-descendants, and also establish the process of demarcation and titling. But even having this law, Nicaragua government have not respect the legislation and having implement the laws to provide protection to the local community and to enforce also the last step of the process of demarcation and titling that we call saneamiento. The current situation of indigenous people and Afro-descendants in the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua persists in a serious human rights violation with a serious consequence of their life and territory. Also, it has been impacted by the massive invasion of the settlers in their territory and the lack of action of the Nicaraguan state to protect their life and their territory. My people have been facing this massive invasion who has been destroying the forests, contaminating the rivers, but also have been murdering and kidnapping and disappearing my people because they have been defending their territory. There continue to be some high level of presence of settlers in the territory, and this situation continue to the settlers has been continue harassing and threatening and attacking the community. So this situation has created even generate forced displacement of a large number of community members has been affected their quality of life because they cannot do their traditional activities, like they cannot hunt, they cannot fishing, and they cannot recollect their traditional medicine. But also it has been so devastated in the community people life that they can even access their food. It's a humanitarian crisis. It's very devastated.
Thank you, Lottie. Earlier in the year, the Oakland Institute released an independent report called the Nicaragua'S Failed Revolution, which described and researched in depth the struggle for saneamiento by the indigenous and Afro-descendant communities in Nicaragua. During the course of research, we had reached out to officials in Nicaragua's, different ministries of mining, Ministry of Environment. And it was very interesting. The response was that there is no problem in the country, that this is a country which deeply respects the process and indigenous rights. And in fact, some of them even alleged that work, your tireless work of individuals like yourself. I mean, this is a lifetime work for you. You are not just a mosquito activist, but you're also a lawyer, which has been representing the communities at the Inter-American Court. You are a lawyer who has faced death threats for the work that you do, and your colleagues have faced death threats. So, the violence that you're describing against the indigenous communities, you yourself have been living with it. Given that, with this recognition of this alternative Nobel Prize, the Right Livelihood Award, I was wondering if you could share what some of the responses have been within Nicaragua and of course internationally.
Well, as you all has known that the situation in Nicaragua has been passing a crisis of human rights, what I would call the deepest crisis in his history in the whole country. So this has been very important to the recognition of the the rights of the livelihood prize for us, because it has been it has highlight the violation of human rights what hardly people in the country are suffering, but particularly for indigenous people and Afro-descendants who has been struggling day by day for their life and for their territory. The society in Nicaragua has seen like sun shining to visualize the situation of human rights in the country. And for indigenous people, it's more important because this has showed the situation what the indigenous people has been struggling and have been facing for many years to protect their life and their territory. So we hope that this could bring to the international mechanism and to the international communities more understanding of how we have been struggling for our land rights, for our natural resource, and for our life.
Yeah, I would share during the course of our research, I will never forget where these indigenous, a large number of indigenous communities live in the North Caribbean coast, taking the wooden boat down with the lawyers, visiting these communities who live on the banks of Rio Coco. I know I was stunned by the fact that the communities who face Zika virus, malaria, disease, hunger, as you pointed out, Lottie, but have no electricity, no medicinal facilities. And yet your work has brought real participatory decision making. The lawyers had traveled with generators, set up these screens so the communities could watch what is happening at the Inter-American Court around their case and get their viewpoints and how they are so together around the demand for saneamiento. So the allegations from officials within the Nicaraguan government, supporters of Sandinistas who believe that this is a hoax, which is led by, foreign funded groups like Sehutkan, it was quite something to watch your work with the indigenous communities, to know names of the children of the different people who walked up. That was a very humbling and inspiring experience. So again, Lottie, congratulations. I cannot think of a more deserving candidate for the Right Livelihood Award. So honored that you inspire not just me, but the world with your fearless strength and your work. Turning to you, Josh. Josh Mayer, you are a researcher at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, and your research focus is on indigenous and Afro-descendant land rights, settler colonialism, and governance in Latin America. But since 2014, your work has focused on the Rama Creole territory, a vast region of southeastern Nicaragua that is legally owned and governed by 9 indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. During the course of our research for Nicaragua's failed revolution, we learned that one of the reasons for the 2018 protests that rocked the country and made it in international headlines around the world was the government's mishandling of the wildfire in the Nicaragua'S biological reserve in the Rama Creole territory. So given what Lottie has just shared, could you expand on the situation in the South Caribbean Coast Autonomous Region of Nicaragua?
Absolutely. And thanks for that question. And it's such an honor to be here with you today, Anuradha, and with you, Lottie. And before answering, I just want to acknowledge quickly the Rama Creole communities who I've been working with, who have been so generous in working alongside me and allowing me to accompany their work, their activism. Of course, I don't speak on behalf of them, but what I'm sharing today is what I've gleaned from my research with them over the past 6 years now. So I think that's a really important point, Anuradha, that the protests that began in 2018 emerged in April of that year, directly in response to this change to the Social Security law. But those protests had been building from a couple weeks before that due to this wildfire in the Indio Maíz Biological Reserve, which is part of the Rio San Juan Biosphere Reserve, a UNESCO recognized reserve. And so that fire began because the immediate cause was a settler who was in this reserve trying to clear land for rice cultivation. And he was in there clearly with the knowledge of authorities, local authorities, who are part of the Sandinista ruling party. And he had been known to be in this part of the reserve illegally, inside this part of the Rama Creole territory. Started this fire, it got out of control, and even once the fire was widely known to be taking place, the Nicaraguan government still failed to take sufficient action to stop it. It really wasn't until 2 weeks later, when rains hit the region, that it was possible to extinguish it. So I think that really illustrates that in the southern part of the Caribbean coast, there are very similar phenomena going on. It's a less kind of murderous form of colonization than what's happening in the northern Caribbean coast region, but it's absolutely the same kind of push factors that are pushing these settlers, colonos, into this region, into heavily forested regions, leading them to burn down wide swaths of this forest, to put in cattle and for their own subsistence agriculture. And that ends up pushing the Rama Creole communities and further north, other communities, Miskitu, Ulwa, and Creole communities further east and toward the coast. So I think that's really important to note. It's also important to note that the government of Nicaragua is actively trying to prevent these communities from protecting their own lands. So that's something that's been going on for a long time. There's been years of the government refusing to accompany these communities. I'm thinking specifically of the Rama Creole communities who have forest rangers to protect their own territory and the Indio Maíz Reserve. So the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Environment has refused to accompany them. The police have refused to accompany them. What happened very recently, the end of last month, was a patrol of Rama Creole forest rangers went out for one of their routine patrols, and they were detained by the army of Nicaragua, and the president of the Rama Creole territory was in fact taken away and arrested, held overnight in a jail in a town outside of the Rama Creole territory. So clearly there is a direct complicity of the government of Nicaragua in what's happening in that region, in the same kinds of ways that we're seeing in the Northern Caribbean coast region, as Lottie has described so well.
Sorry, I'd muted myself to make sure that there's not extra sounds. Josh, you mentioned settlers. I was wondering if both you and Lottie could share a little bit. We hear about the colonos, the settlers, their violence against the indigenous communities. For the viewers and listeners to understand, who are these colonos? What has lured them to indigenous lands? And how are they able to take over farms and forests, and what that process looks like? So Lottie, you want to share that first, that who are these colonos in the north, and then Josh, you in the south? Thank you.
Thank you once more, Anuradha. And it's important to say that Indigenous and Afro-descendants people, we live in 304 villages in 23 territory. And 70 to 90% of our territory is a massive invasion of settlers. And these are armed settlers, most of them. These settlers have been cut down our forests, mining our gold, and also cattle ranch on our lands. So they have been pushing in the communities member of their farmlands and out of their village. These settlers have been destroying our forests, contaminating our rivers, and how I said before, they have been kidnapping our people, disappearing our people, and also murdering. We have lots of, we have more than 46 members of our communities who have been murdered and also injured. And they continue to increase violence in the community. So most of these settlers have been identified by the community members as ex-military who have weapons and has been harassing them and threatening them to leave the most their land. And this is the situation what we has been facing these past 5 years that we has denounced the situation just in 12 community of these 304 village. The land grabbing has taken more than 30,000 of hectares of the farmland, and in addition of that, the people have no access to the area where they could go hunting, where they could go fishing, and where they could make their traditional activities, like, for example, collecting traditional medicine. So these are the type of settlers who we are facing. These are the type of land grabbing settlers that we have been facing. But with all this process of the community facing this violence, is just the government have not only failed in implement this sanitation, the saneamiento process that is the last step to clarify indigenous territory from non-indigenous people like the colonos and the corporation occupying indigenous territory illegally, but also they have been promoting the mining, the logging, and the cattle ranch. And this is what has created a huge impact in the indigenous community territory, that it has caused even food insecurity and citizen insecurity.
Thank you. Thank you. Josh, when we talk about the colonials and settlers, as Lottie pointed out, in the North are very often ex-military people. You know, they might be the former Sandinistas, former Contras who have been settled. Could you talk a little bit about that process in the South?
Yeah, so I think I would say you really have three groups of settlers in the southern region. One of those groups is certainly the ex-combatants, many of whom were resettled within Indigenous and Afro-descendant territories before the titling process happened, many of them in the early 90s after the Contra War. So that certainly is a large phenomenon there and part of the problem. Another group is larger landholders. Many of them have been there, have held titles since the early 20th century that were granted by the various governments of Nicaragua since the annexation of the Caribbean coast under President Zelaya in 1894. So many of them continue to have large swaths of land that they use for cattle ranching and other purposes. But then another group that I think is really important to understand is a group that emerged especially in the 50s and 60s under the Somoza military dictatorship. It's a group of folks who were resettled into the Caribbean coast region in part due to natural disasters that took place in Western Nicaragua, volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. So when these events took place that displaced these folks, many of them who were of indigenous descent on the Pacific coast of Nicaragua or in the Central Highlands. With the support of international organizations, the Somoza dictatorship resettled them into the Caribbean coast region and supported them in carrying out extremely intensive and unsustainable agricultural practices that led to them exhausting their lands and pushing further and further into indigenous and Afro-descendant territories over the past few decades. So, one of the tragedies of the situation is you can talk with some of the older members of these groups who have memories of their lives in Western Nicaragua as indigenous peoples in many cases, as I said, and they've been forced to settle into these other regions and turned into these colonos, into these settlers who are ultimately doing the same kinds of things but doing things that are dispossessing other indigenous peoples, other Afro-descendant peoples of their lands.
So Josh, you touched a little bit on this development model, that people are displaced, they come into areas, they're resettled where there are destructive agricultural practices being followed, so which gives them the right and impunity to push into indigenous and Afro-descendant lands. I'm just wondering, when I look at Pro-Nicaragua country's investment agency even today, and based on what Lottie said, that it declares that nearly 60% of the country's territory is available for mining, 60%. And a lot of that mining, as Lottie pointed out, is happening in the indigenous areas. So in your work, you have exposed other actors as well, not just the settler and colonos who are driving this dispossession and violence against the indigenous and the Afro-descendant communities. Could you comment on that and share some of your work around that?
Absolutely. I think that's such a critical question. So certainly the mining companies are a big part of this, as you pointed out. Mining companies that have massive concessions inside indigenous and Afro-descendant territories that were obtained from the Nicaraguan government without compliance with Law 445, with international statutes on consultation and the right to free, prior, and informed consent of these indigenous peoples. So these massive swaths of land that are now available to mining, these communities, indigenous and Afro-descendant communities who hold titles to those lands, had no role in deciding whether those would go forward, and in most cases do not receive any participation in the benefits of those projects. So that's a huge part. That's one major actor in it. It's also worth noting that some of these concessions that are outside indigenous and Afro-descendant territories are fairly nearby them and end up, these companies use practices to push smallholders off the lands, who are then very likely to be pushed into indigenous and Afro-descendant territories nearby in search for new lands to work. So that's another factor in this. In my research with the Oakland Institute, I've also been looking at forestry companies that are connected, well, in particular, one forestry company that's been connected with the mining industry, that's been funded by international development banks, that's received this international funding in a way that makes it clear that there's the connection between the mining companies and the forestry company is being erased here, and is essentially allowing for the laundering of the capital gained from mining into a supposedly environmentally sustainable forestry initiative very close to indigenous territories. One other point I want to make on some of these actors that are involved in this outside of just the colonos is that the government of Nicaragua obviously has some ability to decide to what extent it's going to interfere in the affairs of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, to create parallel governments, as it's done in many of these communities. But what it doesn't have the ability to decide is, of course, the history of colonial plundering in Nicaragua by European and North American colonial powers. It doesn't have the power to decide on the creation of a highly unequal society that took place under colonial rule, and obviously continued under the Somoza military dictatorship, and was reinforced through U.S. intervention, repeated U.S. intervention in the 19th and 20th centuries. And the situation that's created is a highly indebted country. And when Daniel Ortega returned to power in 2007, he decided that he was going to comply with the IMF and the World Bank and their directives. It can be argued that maybe he didn't have to comply to such a great extent. But from that, he didn't have too many options, right? If they wanted to have any sort of access to financial resources, they were going to need to comply. And comply they have. They've received straight A's from the IMF, and part of that is complying with directives on how to obtain foreign exchange reserves, how to further develop their agro-export model. So is the IMF saying you need to support the illegal colonization of Indigenous and Afro-descendant communities? No, of course they're not explicitly saying that. But to follow the sort of agro-export model that the IMF and the World Bank are promoting in Nicaragua, and that they have been promoting for decades, it's very clear that the availability of lands in the Indigenous and Afro-descendant territories is a key part of that strategy. So especially in a moment of crisis, like the current moment, both due to the COVID-19 pandemic and also due to the economic crisis starting in 2018 with protests in the country, those moments of crisis boost the dependence on the export of beef, the export of gold, export of coffee, and these are all resources that have for a long time been extracted from the Caribbean coast, and increasingly right now. So I think we have to pay attention to these sorts of actors as well that are supporting these industries, both the large-scale cattle and gold industries on the Caribbean coast, but are also through those industries generating further dispossession, pushing colonos further into these territories, and exacerbating these problems.
Thank you very much, Josh. Yes, to the listeners and the viewers, Oakland Institute will be very soon releasing new research following Nicaragua's failed revolution, which exposes some of these actors, gold mining companies from Canada, UK, Colombia, forestry companies with clear links to gold mining companies, and yet getting financed by European development agencies such as FinFund and FMO. So if you'd like to know about that research, I'm going to encourage you to join our listserv, which is the best way to know when new research is released, or follow us on Twitter or Facebook. Also, I want to ask those who are with us, if you'd like to submit a question, please do so in the Q&A. You will have your opportunity to ask your questions of Lottie and Josh as well. Lottie, based on what Josh just described, and I'm thinking again of gold mining, and you referred to violence. And this year, along with COVID, the pandemic of violence has worsened in the North Caribbean coast. And I'm wondering if you might be able to share, because you talked about the 12 communities, and we'll talk more about it, who are at the Inter-American Court, but the number of communities is much larger, and the violence which has been faced by communities other than the Mosquito this year. If you could talk about that.
Well, the members of the community have been denouncing the invasion of the settlers who entered their territory illegally, and also the increase of violence like murdering, kidnapping, but all these violence and the constant denounce that Indigenous people has been denouncing, we always face impunity and a lack of access of justice. So when a country is unable to guarantee the fundamental rights of its citizens, well, there we have the option to seek help from the international system. And Nicaragua, as a country, is part of the Organization of American States. So the bodies that protect us in human rights is the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and the Inter-American Court. So which can go far to judge or punish them if they're found guilty in the violation of human rights. And that is why, together with the Center for Justice and International Law, SEHIL and SEHUDCAN, we asked the Inter-American Commission for protection measure because the violence continue and we continue facing impunity and no access to justice in the domestic law. And there is where in 2015 we got a precautionary measure for the indigenous community. Up to today, we have 12 communities who had precautionary measure from the Inter-American Commission, but meanwhile we has been trying to seek for justice, the violence continues. So we asked the Inter-American Commission to go to the court. So the Inter-American Court gave us provisional measure. What this means for us? This means that now the Inter-American Court is telling Nicaragua that the situation in the indigenous community is, there is a violation of human rights, and have asked the Nicaraguan government to implement concrete action to for protect the life and indigenous people territory, as likewise to implement the last step of the law 445. And that is important for us because part of our struggle is to show the world the difficult situation indigenous people, especially Mosquito people, are facing with the massive invasion of settlers in their territory, and also to show the world how we has been abandoned by the state of Nicaragua, and how the state of Nicaragua has not taken concrete action to protect our life and to protect the territory for indigenous people and Afro-descendants and the Caribbean coast. And for that is very important for us to highlight not only the Inter-American system, but also the UN system and the financial organization like the World Bank and the Inter-American Bank, because we need them. We need the world to understand that we has been trying to protect Mother Nature, not only for us as indigenous people, but for the whole world, that we could live in harmony with our Mother Nature.
Thank you, Lottie. Yeah, it is quite incredible that when you look at the global community, the international community did respond to the very violent putting down of the popular protest in 2018. But when it comes to the plight of the indigenous, the struggle for saneamiento, which you described as getting the outsiders, the outside coloners, settlers, and corporations who do not have the right to be in the indigenous lands or have the consent, they need to leave. That has not been talked about much. And it was wonderful for us to be able to have an impact with the report, Nicaragua's Failed Revolution, to generate millions of media impressions informing the public globally. And while you have this case at the Inter-American Court, and as you pointed out, because of the failure of the domestic mechanisms, that is why the communities have been forced to go to the regional courts. There's still a lot of silence within the international community. When we do hear about violations of indigenous land rights, indigenous rights, violation of the free prior informed consent in Brazil and other places, the Maasai, in our work, but there has been this silence around what is going on in Nicaragua, and I'm really hoping that the Right Livelihood Award will also again really shine the light on the reality on the ground in Nicaragua. So with that, I would ask you, Lottie, I mean, amid such violence, day-to-day threats, not just to the communities. I know what it's like. I've seen you when you receive a phone call from a community that the colonos arrived, homes burned down, people kidnapped, people disappearing, but it's also death threats against you and your colleagues who work at Sehutka. How do you maintain your faith and your struggle for saneamiento? How do you keep on doing what you do and have been doing for decades now? What does it take?
Thank you again for, just like how I had explained you all, that my people has been suffering, and they daily, on their daily base, they live violence, and not only violence, but they has been stopped even to access their land to survive. So they are also living harassment. They has been attacked, and they live daily. They has this. So that is also for us as human rights defenders, not only me, but my team. We has been intimidated, we live harassment, we have death threat, but just for me to continue this work is that we represent not only these 12 communities, we represent 96, but I said there are 304 communities who are struggling day by day for their life and their territory. So when you hear the testimony of these women that they don't have access to food to feed their children, this is what gives you more energy to continue, because those more than 1,000 of women there who say that there is no one to hear their voice, there are no one listening to them, that they is crying day by day. The only thing they are asking is that they remove the settler, that they could go back to their farmland and grow their food, and that they could go and fishing to bring food for their kids. So that is why, even if we live under harassment, if we live under threat, and all those anonyms, what we get and what they say about us, and the radio station and the social media, they said that we are members of terrorists and that we are opposite to the government. We need to continue highlighting the situation of violation of human rights for the indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants, particularly for those women who no one want to hear them, no one want to open a door, because we has asked the government to sit and dialogue and look at a solution. But even if the court, Inter-American Court of Human Rights, have ordered Nicaragua authority to dialogue with indigenous people, there are no political will. So we, even if we under this threat, we need to continue. We need to protect our territory. We need to give some kind of, leave some kind of good practice to our new generation. We cannot stay here and sit without taking out our voice for those women and that future generation who don't have no justice. So we need to continue seeking for that justice. And that's why we have to overcome those fear and lift our voice for them and see when they could have peace in their land.
Very powerful, Lottie. And I'm so glad you shared that. I got to witness that since I've known you, the courage, the belief, and the necessity of the work that you do despite the threats. It is inspiring. Josh, we have talked about the North and the South, and I know you have also worked in the Pacific region. I'm wondering if you can present an overall picture for Indigenous land rights and human rights in Nicaragua. Is the struggle just specific to the two autonomous regions? And also if you could share a little bit about the political parties. I mean, is there any political party which is more respectful or keeping an eye on the national legislation, what its duty is to implement?
Yeah, so to start with the first part of that, I think it's really important to pay attention to what's happening in the Pacific center and north of the country. So the Law 28 and Law 445 that protect Indigenous land rights and Indigenous autonomy, those are specific to the Caribbean coast regions, and they emerge from the history of the 1980s, of the Contra War, and of the specific negotiations that led to this adoption of that legislation. But you also, of course, have Indigenous communities in the Pacific center and north of the country. Often they faced more intensive colonization much earlier on than the Indigenous communities and Afro-descendant communities of the Caribbean coast. But many of them have titles to their land. Some of them have titles dating back to the Spanish crown, dating back to the 16th century. And of course, they have a right to their lands. And those lands are also being colonized in very similar ways, strikingly similar ways, to the situation on the Caribbean coast. They're also facing colonization by mining companies. The intensive kinds of agriculture that you're seeing moving into the Caribbean coast have long been there in the Pacific center and north of the country. So there's been some mobilization for an autonomy law and communal lands law for the Pacific center and north of the country. That's something that's being advocated for within the Alliance for the of Indigenous and Afro-descendant Peoples of Nicaragua, APIAN, which is an organization that Lottie works with as well. And so it is, they also share this demand for saneamiento, the same kind of demand on the Caribbean coast. Not much attention is paid internationally to these communities of the Pacific center and north, but I think it's extremely important that we consider that. And that we think about how that history of colonization of those lands has also informed what's happening now on the Caribbean coast. That there are the same practices that have been developed and refined over time for colonization of these lands. With regard to political parties, the formal political parties in Nicaragua have undergone a really a difficult period of time in the past few years under the Ortega government. The current government controls the Supreme Electoral Council, which has the ability to register and deregister political parties, and in many cases recently has transferred authority within those political parties from the independent leadership to leaders who are perceived to be friendly with the Ortega government. So, certainly the liberal parties that have governed Nicaragua before the Sandinistas were also engaging in colonization. I don't think any of those you could say have been any friendlier to Indigenous rights than the Sandinista government. You do have the historically Miskitu and Caribbean Coast Party, Yatama, that is part of the National Unity Organization, now part of the National Coalition in Nicaragua that's organizing in the lead up to 2021 elections. I think it really remains to be seen how political parties do end up taking part in that election, what role they have. There's an effort to unify political parties in Nicaragua to have a unified opposition to Ortega. I think that's going to be a real struggle, and that they're going through some serious challenges with that right now. And I'm also skeptical, given Nicaraguan history, that whatever emerges from that will be particularly friendly to indigenous rights, unless there's a strong push for that. That's going to have to, it likely will require significant pressure from young people who tend to be more attuned to those kinds of issues within Nicaragua, and more international attention to these issues as well.
There are questions that are coming in. Let me ask one of, which is kind of related to what you said, Josh, but for Lottie, who are some of the international allies in your struggle, and how are they supporting change?
Well, we part of our struggle we has as Indigenous and Afro-descendants people is that we continue our strategic of litigation using the international mechanism, and also building these partners and coalition locally, nationally, internationally, to continue our struggle. But also we try to access the rights of food, implementing the food security by with an agroecology partner. So we has a lot of international partners, national partners. Part of them we has like we have the Environmental Law Alliance Wild World. Those are our partner for many years, ELA. We has also the Occidental Art Ecology Center. We have Oakland Institute, but we also has partners like other national partners with investigation with the Central America University Institute for investigation. And we has other partners with Indigenous people and Afro-descendants organizations to build our strategic and to analyze. We have several of them, but mostly we are focusing in partners who could also help us evidence, like this Oakland Institute report is something we know that we have been saying for many years, why there are no political will of the authorities of Nicaragua to conclude the process of demarcation and titling. And now we see with the Oakland Institute report, independent report, highlight us that Nicaragua authority has encouraged the transnational corporation, and there comes with the transnational corporation the massive invasion of colonization of colonos, and that is one of the reason, that is one of the cause why Nicaragua government have not implemented. So those are the partners, the type of partners we build coalition with. There are many others, but I would like to say that most is in investigations, in implementing action of agroecology. There are many partners to help us with food, to guarantee the rights of food, but by agroecology, that would be a part of the strategy that while we continue our litigation, the community we could provide food for the community, and they could remain in their territory, and the agroecology action is very important for them, to give a food security. Like how I said, while we have our strategic litigation resolved, whilst we seek for justice, and those are the most important partners we has in this building of coalition. That we could guarantee to seek for justice. We need this type of evidence that we could highlight the court and said these are the reasons why Nicaragua government does not comply with the saneamiento.
Lottie, I love the strategy of legal strategy while meeting the needs of the communities and agroecological agriculture, communities who have lost their farms so they can still practice food and deal with the food insecurity that is being created. What a beautiful, grounded, comprehensive vision of your work. Since we were talking about solidarity, there's a question about the similar situation across the border of the Mixtequia in the Gracias a Dios Department of Honduras. And the question is if there's collaboration with people and actors there.
We has collaborated with Honduras, or with the Mixtequia from Honduras, and also with the Garifunos. We did collaborate before they had their process of demarcation and titling in the Mixtequia. So yes, we know the brothers and sisters from the Mixtequia, and we also know some of them from the Garifunos area. So yes, we have been there with them.
Thank you. I have a question for you both. And this has really come up as we released our report, Nicaragua's Failed Revolution. Some people felt that it was, Oakland Institute is an independent policy think tank. We do not accept any funding from any government, any corporation. But we were accused of that this was a US hit job. This was a USAID hit job by people who are not aware of our work and the work of the Institute. So I have a question for you both. We hear about the right-wing President Bolsonaro in Brazil, the threat he poses to the Amazon and the indigenous people. It's in the news. Nicaragua supposedly has a left socialist president, President Ortega. We do not hear much about the Bosavas Biosphere Reserve, which is also designated as a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. Is the rich biodiversity of the Bosavas country's forest protected? Communities who are living here, are they protected? And why there's such a disconnect? Or from what you both have talked about, especially Josh, when he talked about the support that comes in internationally, it feels like despite whatever you can call left and right, this is really the unfettered capitalism at work. So if you would discuss some of that.
Yeah, I can start on that question. Yeah, so I think absolutely it ties into the question of the limited options of the Ortega government when it came back to power, of the existing debt in the country. Certainly, the Ortega government was interested in reducing poverty, finding ways to do that through some degree of international collaboration. That very prominently it involved aid from Venezuela. And it went to parastatal companies, which that's a whole other topic we could address too, that they have a role in colonization as well. So to some extent, there were limited options, but the Ortega government has absolutely engaged in this same project of capitalist expansion, of entering these indigenous and Afro-descendant lands into the grids of neoliberal capitalism, so that they can be exploited for for mega projects that have been proposed, like the Grand Canal, that seems to have to no longer be on the table, but has been discussed since 2012. So I think that's an important part of it. We can see that there's few options outside of, or to resist this kind of neoliberal capitalist expansion. But I think it's also important to see this in the frame of settler colonialism, that the government of Nicaragua, the state of Nicaragua, is a settler colonial state. The settlers arrived from Spain, right, and from other countries like Germany, like the U.S., and they stayed and they remain in power. That is the state that is currently in power. And so to think about this, we need to think about this, the phenomena that are going on the Caribbean coast as part of the same colonization that took place in the Pacific center and north of the country, and that's taking place throughout Latin America. So left, right, absolutely there are some differences in terms of prioritization of the poor, typically of the mestizo poor in Nicaragua. But when it comes to indigenous and Afro-descendant rights, they are always placed after the national majority, which in Nicaragua is this mestizo settler majority. And so I think it needs to be framed in that context.
Lottie, your thoughts?
Yes, I would like to say that we always talk about Nicaragua state. Many people ask me, why you talk about Nicaragua state? Because we have suffered right wing or left wing, all these government has ignored us as indigenous people and Afro-descendants. We has been excluded socially from the National Development Plan. Some of these governments treat us more better than some, but all of these government has excluded indigenous people. But Ortega government has been more violent. We have to say that. Because personally, this situation what we are passing, we has experienced it already with Ortega in 1981, what we call it Red Christmas. What we were displaced, more than 200 community was displaced from their territory. And Ortega said was for the protection, national sovereignty. So we in the Atlantic coast, now Caribbean coast, they always have been changing our name also, but we always identify ourselves as the Musqueam Nicaraguan. But we has been discriminated from the Nicaraguan state. We suffer discrimination, but it's institutionally discrimination. And that's why Nicaragua government has not implemented the process of the communal property. They recognize the private property, the reforma agraria property, but they don't want to protect communal property and instead protect our territory. They has been encouraging transnational corporations to exploit our natural resource like mining and logging. So that's why we as indigenous people and the Afro-descendants who live in the Caribbean coast, we always see that Nicaragua governments does not protect us as citizens. That's why we sometimes we don't, our people don't even have a birth certificate because we are so excluded from the whole national program. We cannot even vote, some of our people, because they don't have identity, cédula de identidad. We are excluded. And that's the way they have to. So I always say that we come. I always tell people, I am coming from communities that burn by casualty and die for necessity, because we has been historical discriminated and there are no political will to implement the laws who has recognized our self-determination and our land rights. So that is the way I see how this government has treated the indigenous people. They just care about the natural resource, what is in our territory, but they don't care if my people have rights to food, rights to live, rights to healthcare. There is nothing such as that. So that is why we are struggling. We need our people to live like human beings. We need our people, those children, to access food, healthcare, education, and that we could remain our self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you, Lottie. I know we have gone a little over time, but I feel this conversation would be incomplete without mentioning the Avastingni case, which led to the laws that we have been talking about. So there was a question about what difference the Avastingni case has made for the indigenous people, the Afro-descendant communities in Nicaragua, since it was decided. And if you could share what the current situation is, Lottie.
Well, with the Awastingni case, we has advanced in let Nicaragua government recognizing that there is no national territory in that area. Because before the Awastingni case, there was a debate with the state that the whole Mosquitia was a national territory. Now, with the Awastingni case, we has overcome that situation, and also with the court resolution order Nicaragua to create a mechanism to demarcate and title indigenous people, and that is where we are now. That is where we has advanced. We recognize that there has been advance in demarcating and titling. 304 community belongs to 23 territory, but none of these community they has implemented the last step that is the saneamiento territorial, to make sure that indigenous people have a control and could use their territory. They need to have the control to manage their territory, and only clarifying non-indigenous people and corporations who use and occupy illegally indigenous territory would be give a guarantee to indigenous territory if we conclude the last step, that they could have a control of their territory and could have their self-determination.
Thank you, Lottie. Josh, I wanted to see, and in fact, both to you, Josh and Lottie, to see if there are any last thoughts. There is a question which says, is it possible for people to exist in a way without dominating? I feel that's a question that we all will be left with to ask of ourselves based on what, Lauren, you started us off with. So I don't want to put you on a spot to answer that, but wanted to see if there were any last thoughts before I turn it over to Lauren.
Well, I'd love to give Lottie the very last word, so if I can just jump in on that quickly. So I think just to add to what Lottie was saying about Awastigni a little bit, I think it really demonstrates the strength of the ideological work at play with the idea of national territory, that you can change the laws, you can grant titles, but still the government and those acting on behalf of the government feel very deeply that the indigenous and Afro-descendant territories of the Caribbean coast are still effectively national territory that can be used at the will of settlers. And so I think here of, I was in the Rama Creole territory and Indio Mais Biological Reserve in the summer of 2019 on a patrol with some Rama Creole forest rangers. And we came across two settlers who had been known to cause trouble in that area and to have a large piece of land. And the president of the community I was there with said, we're here with the knowledge of the army and of the police. They know that we're doing this patrol. And one of the settlers said, well, then why did the army come through and say we should take this land? And so we pushed them to explain this a little further. And he said, oh, well, then some soldiers came through and said, oh, if I had this land, I would have put cattle in here years ago. I would have had this whole place covered in cattle and be making good money. And so they feel authorized by these sorts of interactions with state authorities that are, obviously, the army is not being ordered to say these kinds of things to settlers, but these are ideas that are so deeply entrenched that it's very difficult to just, changing the laws and an order from the Inter-American Court cannot on their own undo that. And certainly these are ideological projects that are embedded in the Ortega government and the entire state of Nicaragua. So what that means for the possibilities of living in a society without domination, I think it means that there needs to be a lot of horizontal solidarity, and of course the only solution to a settler colonial state is decolonization. And I think those are projects that have to go hand in hand.
Lottie?
Well, I believe that we as indigenous people, we have to continue resisting, because it's not easy to face the state and the transnational corporation. But we need to resist, and we need to continue seeking for justice, because we as indigenous people, we need to protect Mother Nature. We believe in that, and we have to continue, like how I said before, to leave something for our future generation. And Nicaragua government don't have the political will, but we have hope, because that's the last thing. We have dreams. And that dream is that we could have a control of our land, that we could use our land. And the hope is because the law, what passed, the law 445, said that communal property is imprescriptible. Our rights doesn't prescribir. So that prescription, that is the hope we have, that these land what have been taken away, we could get it back. And it's going to be difficult, but we have to continue building partnership, building coalition, building a strategy that Nicaragua government could sit and dialogue with us. That's the only thing we are begging for. Sit and dialogue with us, and that we together look at solution, because we don't want our indigenous people to continue losing their life. We want our indigenous people better their life, that their family could access food, that their family could live in peace. And that's the only thing we have been begging. And that we could live in harmony with Mother Nature. That is what we want. We want people to understand that we don't see territory only as a material thing. We have a spiritual connection with the territory. And killing Mother Nature is killing indigenous people. And this is what we need to stop. And only people like you all, in solidarity with us, could take out the word with us, to let the world know that we have to make some kind of change of life. Not only gold and cattle is when we do all those stuff, we are taking away other indigenous family life. So we need to make some kind of stop to this corporation, what is destroying our territory. Thank you.
What an incredible honor to have spoken to you both. I think I'll think of you forever as warriors for hope and dreams. Those who are marathon runners, the struggle continues, and who refuse to give up. There's so much more I would love to ask, but I am going to encourage the viewers, please check out our report, which is available in both English and Spanish. Nicaragua's Failed Revolution, the Indigenous Struggle for Saneamiento. It goes into cattle ranching, the forestry logging schemes, and gold mining, and its devastating impacts on the dreams and hope of the Indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. My apologies for the background noise. So I will mute myself and turn it over to you, Lauren. And thank you for this incredible opportunity with the Growing Culture.
No, thank you. Warriors is right. Josh and Lottie, what an honor to have heard from both of you today. I hope everybody takes these messages over the weekend and asks themselves the questions that they need to ask. You know, there is another way of living, and right or left, sometimes we fall into the same behavior patterns, the same mistakes. There needs to be a global reawakening, a reconditioning, right? And part of that decolonization process, right? The goal of that is the indigenization, which is returning those resources, right? Returning that autonomy and sovereignty into indigenous peoples. And Lottie, like, you are a legend in every aspect of that. And thank you for being that inspiration to us. And we hope that our works individually and collectively hold up a flame to your fire. Thank you so much for everything, right? So please follow and support today's speakers, everybody. Please go to the Center for Justice and Human Rights at the Atlantic Coast of Nicaragua. There's their website, their Twitter handles. You have Josh Mayer, fellow of the Oakland Institute, and of course, Anuradha Mittal in the Oakland Institute. Just like have that bookmarked, that site on your on your browsers. Always learning, and always unlearning. Thank you everyone for tuning in. This has just been an amazing opportunity. And it goes right into our event on Monday, which will be about 9 hours featuring film screenings, poets, musicians, Indigenous voices across Turtle Island. The goal is to imagine a lens of indigenization and what that would look like. And so we are very excited for our Mondays all-day broadcast from 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to 8 or 9 p.m. So it's, you know, wherever you are, just leave it on and join the digital rally. This is really parallel to the work that Lottie is doing, the work of Josh, the work of Anuradha. It's time for us all to listen. Follow Growing Culture for more updates, support the broadcast, of course, share it. This is grassroots efforts, and really thank you to our sponsors for helping this happen. We just launched a legal fund for Black farmers and food entrepreneurs, 100% free legal support in the United States. So thank you, Milgram and Dascom, for helping with that. We're here to support alternative visions, alternative dreams, alternative ideas, and to help cultivate a better world for us all. So once again, I want to really thank Anuradha, Josh, and Lottie. It's just such an honor to be here with you today. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Is there any need for last words? I don't want to carry on, but if anybody has something to say, it's always great if I don't end it, but I'm happy to. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren, and I look forward to Monday. Thank you for elevating the voices that we so desperately need in today's world, from United States to Nicaragua to Brazil to my own country, India. So I'm going to hold the power of this session with you, Lottie and Josh, the courage you provided, and may it bring courage to all. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Lottie.